Let's turn to 2 Kings in chapter 4, and we've been looking at the story of the woman of Shunem, or the Shunamite woman, as we probably know her more by. Last week we covered as to how that she had opened up her home to the prophet of God. Then she has the promise of a son, and today I want us to look at the story of the raising of the Shunamite son. And I will commence the story at verse 14. It is quite a long story, but it shouldn't be the most difficult to follow. Verse 14 of 2 Kings 4. And he said, what then is to be done for her? And Gehazi answered, Verily she hath no child, and her husband is old. And he said, Call her. And when he had called her, she stood in the door. And he said, About this season, according to the time of life, thou shalt embrace a son. And she said, Nay, my lord, thou man of God, do not lie unto thine handmaid. And the woman conceived and bare a son at that season that Elisha had said unto her, according to the time of life. And when the child was grown, it fell in a day that he went out to his father to the reapers. And he said unto his father, My head, my head. And he said to a lad, Carry him to his mother. And when he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon, and then died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and shut the door upon him, and went out. And she called unto her husband, and said, Send me, I pray thee, one of the young men, and one of the asses, that I may run to the man of God, and come again. And he said, Wherefore wilt thou go to him today? It is neither moon nor Sabbath. And she said, It shall be well. Then she saddled an ass, and said to her servant, Drive, and go forward. Slack not thy riding for me, except I bid thee. So she went and came unto the man of God to Mount Carmel. And it came to pass, when the man of God saw her afar off, that he said to Gehazi his servant, Behold, yonder is that Shunammite. Run now, I pray thee, to meet her, and say unto her, Is it well with thee? Is it well with thy husband? Is it well with the child? And she answered, It is well. And when she came to the man of God to the hill, she caught him by the feet. But Gehazi came near to thrust her away. And the man of God said, Let her alone, for her soul is vexed within her, and the Lord hath hid it from me, and hath not told me. Then she said, Did I desire a son of my Lord? Did I not say, Do not deceive me? Then he said to Gehazi, Gird up thy loins, and take my staff in thine hand, and go thy way. If thou meet any man, salute him not, and if any salute thee, answer him not again, and lay my staff upon the face of the child. And the mother of the child said, As the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. And he arose and followed her. And Gehazi passed on before them, and laid the staff upon the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing. Wherefore he went again to meet him, and told him, saying, The child is not awaked. And when Elisha was come into the house, behold, the child was dead, and laid upon his bed. He went in therefore, and shut the door upon them twain, and prayed unto the Lord. And he went up and lay upon the child, put his mouth upon his mouth, and his eyes upon his eyes, and his hands upon his hands, and he stretched himself upon the child, and the flesh of the child waxed warm. Then he returned and walked in the house to and fro, and went up and stretched himself upon him, and the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. And he called Gehazi and said, Call this Shunamite. So he called her, and when she was come in unto him, he said, Take up thy son. Then she went in and fell at his feet, and bowed herself to the ground, and took up her son, and went out. And Elisha came again to Gilgal. And we'll end there just at the beginning of verse 38. And may God bless His word again to our hearts this morning. Last Lord's Day morning we were looking at the job of the prophet Elisha whenever he was going around the different schools of the prophets, or Bible colleges as we would call them today, and he was ministering to the people. We discovered that he came across a woman who, where there was a miracle performed in the first part of chapter 4 with regard to the pots of oil. Then we have been dwelling last week as to how that there was a woman of Shunam who opened up her home to the prophet of God and also to his servant Gehazi. This story is a lovely picture, especially the middle of chapter 4, a lovely picture as to how God graciously works through the lives of other believers to meet his children's needs. And we dwelt last Lord's Day as to how our home was opened up. As often as Elisha the prophet passed by, he was always welcome at this particular house. This woman, we don't know her name. She's just described as a woman. She's called a Shunamite. It isn't her name, but her character that is the main focus of the story. She is described as a well-to-do lady. She is standing in her community. I noticed that she was a woman of wealth, no doubt, because she was able to ask her husband and afford to put an extension onto the house. It was interesting that as Elisha passed to and fro, that she noticed that he was a man of God. She was able to tell the fake from the real. And she perceives that this is a man of God. There seems to be no ulterior motive for making a place for Elisha. She doesn't ask anything from him, nor does she expect to receive anything in return for the use of the room. She sees her wealth as an opportunity to bless others and not just to hoard up things for herself. We concluded last Lord's Day with the fact that she was a woman who was very, very contented. Whenever she was asked by Gehazi what could be done for offering all this hospitality, she says, I'm content. I'm happy with my own people. Literally, I understand the rendering means I'm just fine. I've everything I need and I'm contented and happy. And we know, of course, that contentment is not found in the things that we possess. Contentment is found in the things that we can do without. And so we're told that Gehazi notices that there's no child, and he comes to the prophet of God, and Elisha says, well, look here, you're going to bring forth a son. And this woman of God, she doesn't want her hopes to be built up and then dashed. And so she says, well, don't lie to me. And in her deep hidden emotions, the fears that her hopes might be raised, only to be unrealized, was a thought that she couldn't face. Just to have her hopes built up and then dashed. And so in verse 15, so we're told that she calls, in verse 15, Elisha says, call her to Gehazi, and when he had called her, she stood in the door. I was noticing that phrase, she stood in the door. She didn't even go in to this man. She never enters the room with another man. She wasn't going to be alone in the room with another man while her husband was out in the field. She does nothing to compromise her moral integrity. We should always be careful with our lifestyle. And of course, here in biblical days, this is an interesting story. But mind you, in our society today, that is such a liberal society, where morals and all are to the wall in many ways, we should always seek to live our lives as pleases God and not to put ourselves in the way of temptation. We're told that God gives her a son. A son was classed as a double blessing. In biblical days, if you had a son, that was a double blessing because it meant the continuation of the family name. Now in 2 Kings chapter 4, there's 4 different miracles that the prophet is involved in. We've already covered one of them, which was the woman with her pots of oil and how a miracle was wrought in the midst of very, very deep debt. Then we're told that there was the raising of the Shunammites woman's son, which is the one that we're looking at today. On down the chapter from verse 34 down to verse 41, there's the purifying of the pot of stew. There's this big pot of stew being made, and you can read about it, and it'll help prepare you even for our message next Lord's Day of God, wills and tarries. And then in the latter part of the chapter, there's the feeding of 400 men. These were all miracles. I want to say that it is so easy for any of us to get wrapped up with our children. Now, children are very, very important. They're very important. But it is so easy for people to get so wrapped up in their children that they actually seek their own happiness and sense of worth in their children's accomplishments rather than in the Lord. They become so wrapped up in their children's lives, their growth, their changes, their talents, their accomplishments, their problems, their pursuits, and their successes. Now, naturally, this is normal to a point. And there's something wrong with any mother or any father who doesn't get excited. We saw Daisy walk this week for the first. Of course, we weren't in her presence, but now with all this technology, everything's sent to you. And of course, that causes excitement whenever a child walks. I was talking to someone this week, and they were telling me that their child is, mind you, past a number of years now, and has never talked yet. And so there's an element of concern there. And so it's only natural that we'd get excited. It's a legitimate means of joy. But the Bible tells us that nothing is to take the place in our lives as a source of security and significance and satisfaction, not even our children, over the Lord. And we see that in the lovely story and the challenging story of Abraham and his son Isaac. And so this woman had accepted her lot in life. She was involved in serving the Lord. She was involved in serving her husband and her community. And now, all of a sudden, there's this promise of a child. With all the joy, the responsibility, and the change that the world would bring to her, after all, her husband's old now. He's an old man. It's going to take a miracle. And so the home was going to be changed. Now, Scripture doesn't describe her response, but I'm sure that you can immediately imagine the excitement that went through her mind, the joy, the hope, but also the fear of disappointment. What if things does not work out? What if my hopes is built up, I'm going to have a child only to be dashed? You see, but once again, we're told that this woman has settled it a long time ago, that she's resigned herself to the fact that she will spend her days without children. She has resigned herself to that fact. But now this is all opened up again with the promise of a child. And so it becomes an issue, it becomes a hope, and also a fear. And I'm sure in a sense she became vulnerable, or felt in a vulnerable position. We all tend to become settled and comfortable in our lives as they are. And so often any real change in our lives will mean being more vulnerable to pain, to pressure, and the things that can be brought with sorrow and with suffering. But it can even bring a test to our allegiance to God. And we know that in the story of Hannah too. Whenever Hannah went up into the temple and she wept, she was broken in spirit because simply she was without child. This woman we can draw from the fact that a strong faith and one that is growing learns to trust God with their complete life. Now, this means we must learn to step out in faith. And there are times as God's children we must do that. We must learn to step out in faith. We must learn to become vulnerable at times, to leave the future in the Lord's hands, trusting Him daily and enjoying each day that the Lord gives to us by obeying His word. Now, again, and you may forgive me for quoting, but I'm going to quote UCB notes again this morning. They're absolutely excellent as to how important it is to present our bodies a living sacrifice, and how a living sacrifice had to be bound to the altar because automatically it would want off the altar. A living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is our reasonable service. You see, some people are afraid to get close to people or to establish close relationships because they don't want to become vulnerable. I've met people like that. I'm sure there's times in all of our lives where you don't want to get too close maybe to someone lest you become vulnerable. And that's why I think I was reading a story the other day about somebody that is mourning the death of a friend that they have never met. I began to try to work it out in my mind. How would you mourn for someone that you'd never actually met? And this chap is describing the grief that he is going through for someone that he has been friends with, but he's never met them. Now, some of these things are difficult maybe to get your head around sometimes. But I'm just saying that there are times in our lives whenever we will meet those that may feel vulnerable and will not want to get to form too many friendships or meaningful relationships. And as a result, perhaps they don't get into an opportunity to be a help or to be a ministry to others. But I want to move on to the awful calamity. Because this little boy here grows into a big boy. And we're told in verse 18, and when the child was grown, it fell on a day that he went out to his father to the reapers. Now he's out in the field with his father. Whether he's working or whether he's just watching his father, we don't know. It could be either. But there's some things that I want to point out here. You see, we're told here that this lad, all of a sudden, he complains about his head. And he cries out to the father, "My head, my head." Now, some commentators will tell us that this lad could have had an aneurysm, what we would call today. Some would say it could have been a brain hemorrhage. There are others say that it was sunstroke. But you know, as I was studying this week, you know really what I tried to get into was the thinking of the father. What kind of a bond was there between father and son? I can't understand why the father continued to work in the field and ask somebody else to carry his child. And I tried to put myself in those shoes, and I think any of us would too, that we would say, well, look here, if our child is ill, maybe the father thought he wasn't as bad as he was. Sometimes maybe fathers can be like that. Well, it's just a cold, it's just this, that or the other thing. Maybe sometimes that could be the thinking. But we're told here that whenever the lad complains about his head, he said to a lad, "Carry him to his mother." Now, my own mother reared a big family. And she used to quote whenever she's living, hard to believe she's 20 years dead this year. But she used to quote whenever she was living, whenever there was grandchildren born and all the rest of it, the late Dr. Henry from Dungannon. And she would always say, Dr. Henry said, never take a chance with a child. Never take a chance. And I suppose Dr. Henry was an old ex-military doctor. He knew what he was talking about, I'm sure. But that's what he said. I sat and shared tea one day with a farmer man. And one of the Church of Ireland halls was a funeral that I was at. And he told me about his son, his only son. And he said he died in my arms. Now, the son, I think, was in his 50s. Sadly took cancer. This man described to me, he said, I held him in my arms and I tried to give him a wee drink of water, and he said he died in my arms. That must be a terrible experience. Must be terrible. It's only those that have gone through it will fully understand it. But the father tells the servants to carry him home. It looks life-threatening, and so, well, you would imagine that the father would have gone. And that just would tell me something that we ought always to try to maintain a good relationship with our children. It may not always be possible. And I know there can be many different factors and many elements, but it may not always be possible. But if possible at all, we ought to. I was telling my brother the other day, I said, I remember years ago, whenever one day in one of the papers, the Tyrone Constitution, when I was a young lad, I saw someone was selling a racer bicycle. And mind you, with a big family and all the rest of it, there was no abundance of money. But it was to a box number. Somebody was selling it to a box number. And they were looking £15 for the bicycle. That was an awful lot of money back then. And I remember writing off about the bicycle. And I said to my brother this week, do what I remember well. And it's these things that stand out in your childhood. My father, I showed him the letter, never thinking he would do it. And he went with me and he bought me that bicycle. And £15 was a lot of money. But you remember those things. Dear friend, as someone has said, it's good maybe to do your giving while you're living. You'll see the smile on their face then. It's good to do that. But I don't honestly know what kind of a relationship there was, and I'll not go beyond the scripture here. But he just says, he obviously continues working, and he says, take the child to his mother. Now, he's going to die a very short time later. Perhaps the father thought that wasn't that serious, but we're told that he dies in his mother's arms. I want you to notice the tremendous courage the Shunammites showed. You see, once she perceives that her son has died, she lays him on Elisha's bed. Remember, she has made a wee place for Elisha the prophet to stay. In the room, in Elisha's room she calls it. Now, she rushes then off to Mount Carmel because she wants to get in contact with the prophet again. She wants Elisha to come on the scene, to see, to understand what she's going through at present. And so she rushes to Mount Carmel, where Elisha lives. She travels as fast as she could, we're told, by donkey. It wouldn't have been very comfortable. And as she nears Elisha's home on Mount Carmel, Elisha could see her coming in the distance, and he sends out Gehazi to ask the woman, is everything all right? You may say to me today, why did the woman say everything was well whenever it wasn't well? I believe the woman was a woman of faith. And she saw beyond everything that the supreme will of God, that she had seen God in the past, and she was trusting God still in the midst of all this here. And so Gehazi, Elisha's servant, he rushes out and he asks the question, is all well? And the answer was, all is well. And then verse 27, we're told, she brushes aside from Gehazi because she wants the man of God. And when she came to the man of God to the hill, she caught him by the feet. She clutches his feet. Now, I understand this was a posture, or classed as a posture of humility, of grief, of supplication. Gehazi wants to push her away. That's what he wants to do. But Elisha sternly rebukes him for not noticing the woman's distress and accommodating her in the midst of her sorrow. You see, all Gehazi sees in this woman is another demanding woman. That's all he sees. Now, the Bible describes a little bit about Gehazi. And I'm going to deviate for a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to finish with Elisha and the restoration, or the resurrection of the son. But the Bible sheds very little light upon this servant Gehazi. It doesn't tell us much about his background or his position, but he heeds Elisha's command, and there's a sense of his basic unbelief and his impure motives, because we read about them, and you can check this sometime. In chapter 5, verses 20 to 27, he exposes his great greed for money and the power that it brings, and God through Elisha curses Gehazi and his descendants with leprosy. And then, of course, we see him here in chapter 4, where he has a considerate attitude. He's a servant who never learns how to care for those that he serves. That's how I would see it. He is a man with great potential for growth in God's ways and service, who instead seeks material gain and wealth and position in society. You see, he's like what the New Testament talks about, the tares amongst the wheat. And so that's a little bit that we know about Gehazi. He's eventually smitten with leprosy and his descendants. But back to the child again, and with this I'll close. We're told then in verse 31, and Gehazi passed on before them and laid the staff upon the face of the child. There was neither voice nor hearing Wherefore he went again to meet him and told him, saying, the child is not awake. Now, today we wouldn't use the term, there's neither voice nor hearing. We'd use the term today, there's neither pulse nor breathing. That's the terminology we would use. You see, obviously the Israelites knew that the life is in the flesh, the life of the flesh is in the blood, in Leviticus 17 and verse 11. God breathed into Adam's nostril the breath of life, and he became a living soul. Now, the writer of 2 Kings here is not giving us medical evidence or clinical proof of the child's death, but he's making comments about the state of death. When someone is dead, they can no longer speak, nor hear, or communicate whenever they're dead. And we're told in verse 31, the child is not awake. Now what does Elisha do? Gehazi is a lot younger than Elisha. He can run a lot faster. And so Elisha says to Gehazi, you run, put the staff, my staff, the prophet's staff, on top of the dead child. And that's what he does. But it makes no difference. And then this woman, who apparently had never trusted Gehazi, would entrust neither herself nor the final outcome of her son to him, but rather stayed with Elisha until he would reach Shunam. And as Elisha and his mother approached the city, Gehazi reports that though he has carried out the instructions and put the staff on the child, there's nothing has happened. And what does Elisha do? He goes straight to the dead child. He puts the others out, and he seeks God. Elisha's actions are not merely the motions of a man attempting artificial resuscitation. No, the child was dead. As apparently the child was dead for several hours. And then in verse 34 we're told, with Elisha on top of the child, the flesh of the child waxed warm. It wasn't resuscitation. Remember, it was the raising of the dead through prayer. Do you know, I thought this week, I've seen over the years, and I know that some of you have, and I would want to be as sensitive as anyone else, but you have seen children at the point of death, and through prayer, God has raised them up. Through prayer. And that's something to be eternally grateful and thankful for. Sadly, I've been with those and that hasn't happened. And so that's rather difficult at times, perhaps, and distressful to cope with. But I'll say this here, dear friend, there was the triumph of the prophet. He began on his knees, we're told. And in verse 32, when Elisha was come into the house, behold, the child was dead, and laid upon his bed. He went in therefore, and shut the door upon them twain, and prayed unto the Lord. Whenever we're in a desperate crisis, it can cause desperate prayers. And so he began on his knees. The man of God must be alone with God because he can communicate the life of God. There was personal contact with the child. Personal contact, we're told, with the eyes, with the mouth, with the hands. And that tells me in another sense that men and women today are spiritually dead. And how as God's people we have to come in contact with those that are spiritually dead and seek to see them brought to life in the Lord Jesus Christ. We're told in verse 34 there was intense desire and effort because he went in and lay upon the child and put his mouth upon his mouth, his eyes upon his eyes, his hands upon his hands, and he stretched himself upon the child, and the flesh of the child waxed warm. Then he returned and walked in the house to and fro, and went up and stretched himself upon him, and the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. We know, of course, 7 in the Scriptures is the number of perfection. I'm not going to read anything else into that. But we're told the child opened his eyes, and he called Gehazi and said, call this Shunammite. So he called her, and when she was come in unto him, he said, take up thy son. There was patience. There was perseverance in prayer. The miracle didn't happen all at once. Elisha had to hold on to God and to work on in faith. Maybe sometimes as God's people, we fail because we give up too easily. I'll end it there. God willing, next week we'll look at the big pot of stew that Elisha was involved with. We're going to sing our closing hymn,